This is our longtime colleague, and has he been busy? Terrific to carve out Mondays for us. He is the political analyst across the CBS television stations and also across iHeartRadio. How about it for the great Gary Dietrich, everyone? Hey, Gary.
Hey, Mark,
Let me.
a little bit delayed, but good to talk to you on the so-called morning after, at least my morning after with you, Mark.
Yes, it's true. We haven't had a chance to speak since the election. So let me start with the wild stuff, okay? I mean, obviously, this election was, I think with the exception of the vaunted Iowa poll, which we heard, oh, she's the best. You've never heard a pollster like her. She's so good. That was the one that was most
Yeah.
off, I think. But otherwise, the pollsters were right in the sense that, this election came down to a sliver. But we'll get back to that in a second. I want you to address or just button out what we've been talking about, which is associated with a conspiracy of some kind, the involvement of Starlink, the involvement of Elon Musk. The Musk agenda is so clear and unapologetic, and he really took over X as a propaganda platform for Trump and the right. And it's not a big leap to think that with Starlink's involvement, there can be a credible narrative crafted about how he might have actually influenced the outcome. So I'll shut up in a second, but I just wanted to kind of just establish against that background, these things are coming forward. Explain to us how Democrats and women who are Democrats, because Kamala Harris is a woman and there might be an aversion to voting for a woman and all this sort of thing, did well in so many states that Donald Trump still carried top of ticket. Explain that bifurcation, that disparity. Democrats do well in a state, but Trump still wins it. Explain ticket splitting and all of that.
Yeah. Well, one of the things about this election that's become clear, Mark, was that some of the assumptions going in, even by the both parties themselves and certainly by pollsters, turned out to at least not be completely true, or not. Maybe another side of the coin is not true enough. What do I mean by that? Like the margins, for example, for Latinos. It wasn't just and African Americans. It wasn't just young Black and Latino males that Trump did better on than he did in 2020. It was across the board with those demographics. The same with women, by the way. You know what I mean? And I think it's this wholesale increase when you only have one state, the state of Washington, who Harris did better than Biden did in 2020. That's a wholesale reckoning. And I think that's part of what's still settling in about how could Trump possibly win so big, Mark, across so many demographics and so many states, including blue states. I mean, when you come as close as he did, even in a state like New Jersey, that is a major league wake-up call. And I think that's what I think Democrats are particularly grappling with now, today, and will going forward is, okay, if we didn't pick up as much of the female vote or this, that, but it's the wholesale across the board that I think is really causing the consternation. And now, of course, as happens in every election, has happened with the Republicans after they've lost some major elections. The internal reckoning is happening, and the finger pointing, and how could this possibly happen?
I'm going to get to the politics because I think you can play that reckoning thing from two perspectives, and I'm really anxious to hear your thoughts. Tony, before I leave the conspiracy stuff aside, play for Gary Dietrich that video of the FedEx driver. Do you have it? And I think that this is sort of, again, all of these little things pile up to make the case for, hey, what happened here? So you can, again, contextualize. Go ahead, Tony, just hit... So a driver finds a box of early voting ballots in the middle of the road. Okay, and there they are. They show them to you. All right. It feels so 2020 what I'm doing right now, but nonetheless, these are actual ballots. And as it turns out, this is in Miami-Dade County. Initially, he thought they were garbage. The driver said he took them to a police station. I'm just reading for those who are listening. The bag and the seals were intact. Nothing was tampered with. It seems like the incident was an accident. The worker who was transporting the ballot was terminated, according to Miami-Dade County Elections Department. That is that. there's going to be that kind of thing that we're going to see in every election?
Oh yeah, I mean, you can go back. We all focus on 2020, of course, but the most famous of all is Florida, Gore v. Bush,
Sure.
538 hanging Chads. I mean that's was this Chad hanging? Was it not hanging? I mean, every election cycle there's some of them. It's just that, of course, last cycle, the claim that there was a scale and a scope and a size to swing the election. That, of course, as you pointed out, Mark, was never proven by the Republicans. But in every election cycle, you use the word, you can use irregularities, you can use whatever you want. That happens whenever you're casting 150 million plus ballots. Things are going to happen. Do they happen to the point where an election has been materially affected? So far in American history, we don't have any evidence of that. Now, Republicans would claim that Chicago in 1964 might have violated that, but excuse me, 1960. But that's neither here nor there. I mean, the fact is, Mark, there's irregularities. Yes. Have some of them been demonstrated? Yes. Enough to swing elections? So far, no.
Well, the recounts that have been demanded, or the investigations that have been demanded, they should follow, right? I mean,
absolutely. I mean, regardless of party, look, we have to take a step back from whether people loved or hated Trump, loved or hated Harris. We want an election process that people believe in, right? That has institutional integrity. So after every election, irregularities should be investigated. Things should be gotten to the bottom of. I don't care whether it's for a little tiny township race, clear up to the presidency. That's important. It's important that people believe in the process. And I think that's absolutely vital.
It's said by Dorian, if Elon Musk has something to do with the voting machines, it's going to come out one way or another. And again, as I mentioned, Starlink was linked to the data collection. Again, not the voting. The machines are completely separated. They're not connected to the internet in any way. That should give people a lot of confidence in the system. But then when you get to data transfer and tabulation, you do get into internet-related concerns that might go back to Musk. Now, I want to quickly pivot to the strategy and the framework that you can put this election in. We were talking about the fact that Democrats have to sit down and really look at their message, look at their philosophy moving forward. They may have to change their appeal, although, as I have noted here, I mean, they're the ones who actually have done things, I think, for the working man, to use the oft-used phrase. In fact, you have a president who walked the picket line in Detroit with striking auto workers. I mean, Donald Trump set up a photo op with a bunch of auto workers who weren't unionized. They weren't on strike. They were paid to be there. So you have these, again, the strength of messaging, of advertising, and then the courage of your convictions, minus the advertising. Again, I have an expressed bias. I'm not a Trump fan, but more to the point, how much do they really have to sit down and change their positions or change what they feel? In other words, should they go more moderate? Should they go more left? Should they go? And how much of it is, hey, they just kind of barely lost if you actually look at the numbers. And maybe it's a question of messaging, of advertising, of controlling a little bit more in the way you tell people what you do.
Yeah, well, I think, Mark, you can kind of divide elections up into three pieces, okay? One is sort of the facts on the ground. What are the realities, Like, do we have inflation since 4 years ago? Yes. Is it about in total and aggregated about 20%, of just real average in terms of grocery prices? Yes. So you have some sort of basic realities that you have to deal with. Then secondly is the policies that you've used or haven't used to address those, right? What are you going to do then about that? Or let's throw another big one in there. Immigration. Did we have millions of people come across the border in the last 4 years? Yes. What was the size and scope of that? People can debate about that. Then the question becomes, okay, so what did you do about that over the course of that term? And then finally, the last thing about it is, I guess I would call it the product. You know what I mean? It's sort of like, okay, so how are you going to message then what those facts were, what you did or didn't do about it to help communicate that reality to people. And all three of those pieces, interestingly, Democrats are now looking at. Like, did we have an immigration problem or didn't we? Right? Did we have realities, in terms of price increases and economic stuff like that? Yeah. Well, some of those favored Democrats, some of them clearly didn't. But I think where Harris and Biden got stuck initially, before you get into the messaging part of it, was in the policy thing. How do you explain how you did or did not address those? And as you know, Mark, she struggled with that. She really struggled with that. Okay, so what have you done and what are you going to do to address prices? Well, we're going to go after, we're going to go after price gouging with grocery stores. Well, then the obvious question was, how come you didn't do that over the last 4 years? And then, of course, the one that really tripped her up, what would you do differently than President Biden going forward? And she really struggled with that question. And then finally, on that messaging component, the third piece of every campaign, there too, it seemed like they had a hard time getting traction on issues that in the end, and we talked about this several times, Mark, over the last several months, the thing about democracy and all that's fine. But that was not the top 3 or 4 issues for people, right? It was the economy / inflation. It was immigration. It was abortion, right? Those were the top 3 in all the polls. And except for the third one, she really had trouble getting policy positions and messaging that ultimately people would move the needle in the ballot box.
Yeah. I never believed in the democracy thing. I never thought that from a political standpoint was really just going to cut through. It's too amorphous an idea. It's too, and no one believes it's going to happen. We all just, because we're Americans, we're fat and happy. Yeah, I know, democracy is going to be a fascism. Right. It's Monday Night Football tonight, so who's playing? I mean, that's sort of our general disposition as Americans. I think we've gotten very used to this system, and we kind of feel it's bulletproof in a sense. So I never liked the democracy thing. I always liked the fact that you talked about, and you've talked repeatedly about the fact that, that's the thing that the Dems keep talking about, and while it may be true, it is not the thing that cuts through. It's not the thing that makes everybody's to-do list for top of the list. They had over 3 years to figure out a hack. Musk didn't hang around for nothing. A woman in Australia threw ballots in the trash because she wanted Trump to win and was arrested. I mean, there is all of this stuff. The stuff that percolates both through our conversation and through the ashes of this election as the Democrats look over it, it'll always include this kind of thing. Talk to me about the actual votes. Gary Dietrich, when you look at the votes, do they make sense? 10 million fewer people showed up for Kamala Harris, for example, than did for Joe Biden?
Yeah. Well, the 10 million number is going to be the interesting one, Mark, because Trump's actual votes, you compare 2020, I was looking at that just this morning. It's remarkable that his vote count is almost identical. What I mean, but I'm saying several 100,000 different, right? But 75 million roughly and change. Now, we don't have all of California counted yet. There's a big chunk yet to come in. Hers dropped about 10 million from Biden. Now, is that a believable figure? Well, I think if you look at what people were talking about the enthusiasm gap amongst Democrats, especially amongst key demographics, working class folks / union people, when you started hearing, Mark, from people like the Teamsters, that 60 to 65% of their members in their own internal balloting, their own internal polling, 65% said they were going to vote for Trump. That was a huge red flag for Democrats. Same thing with young Black, young Latino voters, particularly males, and even amongst female voters, they did not turn out as strongly as initial polling said they might for Harris. So it was that massive drop-off, and probably a lot of them not necessarily voting for Trump because Trump's numbers stayed the same. But Democrats are saying now, Mark, our people, too many of them, stayed home.
Yeah, this is a thing that has to be viewed in context, I feel, which is when you look back at the Trump years when he was president, the end of his term was marked by the chaos that really, in my judgment, informed his entire stay there in the White House, but it really was amped up like crazy by COVID, right? So you have people dying, you have, this disorganized craziness with whether or not you're going to get the personal protective equipment. It was state by state. It was like a Hunger Games setup, like who's actually going to get what they need. It was just an absolute mess. Meanwhile, people aren't working. They're being told to get vaccines. They're being told to stay home. Schools are closed, reopened, closed, etc. So it's a mess. So Biden comes in, and there's no transition. Trump won't meet with him, et cetera, and he pulls it together. I think the guy deserves some credit for that. But the reason he comes in, I'd suggest to you, is because people were responding to that chaos, and that's why they showed up in such immense numbers at the ballot box. Out of this 4-year period, you don't have that chaos, and so Trump was able to energize his people. And the Harris people to whom you've just referred, like the 10 million fewer that you've just talked about, they just weren't motivated, probably because this election didn't really take place amidst the kind of chaos that I just described. Does that hold water?
Yeah, well, Mark, I think that's certainly going to be one of the threads, the themes, like how was the context this time around different than the last time? So I think there's some validity to that. But there is another concern just about candidates. I mean, and all of a sudden in the last few days, Nancy Pelosi, man, I can't there's going to be no Thanksgiving invitations between the Pelosi and the Biden household anytime in the near future, okay? I mean, what she started saying in the last few days, well, you know what, if Joe had just gotten out earlier, wow. I mean, what is she the point she's trying to make? This, to me, I think is going to be one of the most interesting postmortems of this, politically speaking, is that Kamala Harris never ran a campaign nationally. She dropped out of the primary, remember, in 2020, before the first one. She'd never gotten somebody to actually put a mark next to her name. Does that make any sense? Establish any candidate loyalty, personal affinity. People would say brand loyalty. Yeah, they voted for Biden in 2020. Famously, people, the pollsters, all the exit polls show this forever and ever, amen. People vote for the top of the ticket, not for the VP. So she had to, in 3 months' time, try to establish some sort of momentum, candidate loyalty that was something other than I hate Donald Trump. And I think that was a huge challenge. And I think that's part of what Pelosi's trying to get at.
Yeah, that's really interesting, the Pelosi thing. There's probably truth to it, right, Gary? I mean, for just the reasons you've suggested, had there actually been a primary, had Biden actually just been the 4-year president, you would have had, I think, Kamala Harris primaried out. I don't believe I've never been a Kamala Harris fan particularly. I certainly, as I've said before, I'd vote for my cat before I'd vote for Donald Trump. But I do think that her viability as a candidate was never really tested in the ways that you described. So tell me where we go from here. For Democrats, they may not take the House. I mean, likely looks as though they're going to be sitting this one out. So you've got a president with a radical, aggressive agenda, in my judgment, and he's put in people who are loyalists to him. That seems to be the Nikki Haley's of the world. They're not going to have a role in a Trump administration. And the Democrats are really limited in terms of what they can do. I'd love you to mention also, if you would, these appointments that Trump has already asked Republican senators to be party to, that sort of has both a political side and a kind of a working congressional side. You can explain how it works. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, real quick on the appointment process. Trump wants that appointment process to be expedited. Why? Because he knows very well that he's basically got 2 years before midterms, and I'm going to come to that in a second. I want to give our Democratic friends some glimmers of hope. All right. So those are coming, friends. Hang in there. All right. So, but on the political side and the appointment process, this becomes exceptionally important. Getting your people in place to move a policy agenda in the first 12 months. And Trump does not want to be spending 6 to 9 months on appointments. He wants to move on that policy right away, and so do Republicans. So that's the appointment side. They want to move that through. Now, for Democrats, where do they go from here? All right. There's still a lot of, licking the wounds and all, understandably. But the people inside the Democratic Party that are real activists, they're like go-getters on this, are already saying, okay, where do we go now, this week and going forward? Here's a couple things. Number one, They have the filibuster in the Senate. Yes, they're going to be down, looks like maybe as many as 6 seats, but they have the filibuster. Now, that's been, people have decried that back and forth. McConnell says he would never do away with that. The incoming Senate leadership looks like they're going to take us, that is Republican leadership, going to take a similar position. So that will be the immediate backstop that Democrats will have. Lock things up in the Senate when they feel like they need to. That's number one. Secondly, they'll be looking at the midterm election immediately. Okay, the House majority, you're right, it looks like Republicans are going to take the House. It won't be by a big margin. It might be 5, 6 seats again. Okay, who knows? The bottom line is Democrats will say, let's target those districts that we know we can get or think we can get in the midterm. Traditionally, as you know, Mark, historically, the party in power in the White House loses typically seats in the midterms. That's where they'll look next. Thirdly, the Senate map in the midterm election in 2 years is much more favorable to Democrats than this one was. There'll be many more Republican seats that they have to defend, so they'll be looking at that as well. And then finally, yes, make no mistake about it, the campaign bus was warmed up here in Sacramento for Gavin Newsom, and it only took 48 hours. He called the special session in California. I'm sure we'll be talking about that in the coming weeks. And, you know, he's centered himself as sort of like, you know, the Luke Skywalker, the champion of the resistance movement against Trump. He, Shapiro, these other names you've heard in the past, Gretchen Whitmer, that 2028 bus is already pulling out of the station, and it will be picking up speed in the months ahead.
It would be hard for me to believe that the Democrats wouldn't win in 2028 because Trump's administration is going to be a mess. I hope we survive it. I hope the government survives it. These are my opinions, not yours, of course. But I think I have a very bleak view of where we're going to end up at the end of a Trump administration, which means that Democrats, just like the last administration with Trump, will, I think, be motivated to show up, and even crossover voters will be motivated to show up. So that bus that you're talking about that's pulling out, I would think it would get some serious velocity. All right, so as we look at the days ahead, literally, I've noticed the Biden administration, they pulled out of this climate meeting that they were going to, didn't pull out. I just don't think that, I think the plan was for Biden to be there, and now it's not. These things that seem to underpin a lot of what their policy was, they kind of die on the vine because of just this, you can see this coming wave that's just essentially going to wash them all out.
Well, I think that, you know, it would, in the view of the Biden people now, it would look foolish to go and say, I'm going to advance an American policy when, you know, in 60 days, that's going to be completely different. So I just think there's almost a face-saving part of that of like, look, this doesn't make any sense for us to go and try to be major players in something when we're going to have a wholesale change in our administration. If Harris had won, that would be totally different.
Were you surprised by anything else in this election when it comes to the popular vote? I mean, that was one of the big surprises for me. I really felt that he had a good shot to win the Electoral College, but I was astounded that he wins the popular vote. Was there anything on your radar that you didn't necessarily think would be there?
Yeah, well, I think you really hit on it for me, Mark. I was really on edge towards the end about people, of course, wanting me to put my dime down. Is it going to be Trump? Is it going to be Harris? I mean, it looks so neck and neck. But you made a point in the early part of this interview, Mark, that I think was really important. All the really sharp, you know, prognosticator types, the Nate Cohen's of the world, the others, the Silvers, you know, said, look, all we need is a couple of percentage point one way or the other, and all of those dominoes in the swing states could fall one direction. And that's exactly what happened. But it was the popular vote. And then, again, something I said earlier, 49 states moving in Trump's favor, only one in the Democrats' favor. That is the state of Washington. The wholesale across the board, Trump did better with almost every single demographic. How many counties, if you look at that New York Times map, how many counties moved red versus moved blue, nationally speaking? I think it was the size and scope of the movement politically. That is what has shocked Democrats, and that actually surprised me as well.
A quick question. Randy has asked Dietrich about majority of Muslim voters in Michigan voting for Jill Stein. Can you speak to that?
Well, I think that was a protest vote. There's no question about it. You know, they weren't huge Trump fans in the sense that they're concerned about Trump's stance on Israel, et cetera, but they just could not. I mean, you know, they had their protest vote, as you know. in the primaries. And they said, look, we are not going to support a Biden-Harris administration, given what we feel like you folks have done to not take a more aggressive stance. And so I think the Stein vote and to some degree the Trump vote was clearly a protest. We're not going to be taken for granted. And that certainly did not help her in places like Michigan.
And then to button us out, just so you know, it's out there. There is this from the Constant Gardener in caps. Trump's base was stagnant for almost 10 years, and he lost the popular vote twice. Suddenly he wins the popular vote in all swing states? No, I don't think so. So the conspiracy theories live on. Gary, you're the best. Thank you so much for being part of our conversation today. I don't know what's ahead. I think it could be kind of a rocky ride, but I'm looking forward to talking about it with you. Thanks a lot, pal.
Thanks, Mark.
Gary Dietrich, everybody. Loving that. And Gary Dietrich is brought to us by Bill Campbell at RE/MAX Gold. In fact, Bill is terrific, particularly in Northern California. If you need a highly respected real estate professional, if you're relocating in or leaving, check out Bill Campbell, RE/MAX Gold. Call or text him 530-448-7474, 530-448-7474. Bill Campbell at RE/MAX Gold. Right on. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.